The Cathar vessel, Logic's spear, was a testament to its creators. Every corridor was an identical shade of utilitarian grey. Every junction was a perfect 90-degree angle. Every sound was a muted, purposeful hum, filtered and regulated to prevent unnecessary sensory input. On board, Prime Analyst Vrel adjusted his optical enhancers, his multifaceted eyes taking in the sterile perfection of Research Bay 7. Within its shimmering containment field, the anomaly pulsed, a knot of energy that defied every Cathar law of physics. It neither radiated nor absorbed in any predictable manner. It simply was, and its existence was an affront to Cathar understanding. For cycles, the finest Cathar minds had been thrown at the anomaly. They had applied every algorithm, every proven theory, every logical deduction. The result was always the same: null data, paradoxical readings, and a growing sense of intellectual impotence, an emotion the Cathar found deeply unsettling. Their civilization, built on the unshakable bedrock of logic, was stagnating. The rate of new discoveries had slowed to a crawl. The anomaly was a symptom of a deeper problem. Hence, the humans. Vrel observed them now, 3 of them, clustered around a holographic interface in the adjoining observation chamber. They were loud. Not in decibels necessarily, though their speech patterns were certainly more varied and inflected than Cathar monotone. It was their energy. They gestured. They paced. One, a female designated Jones Alara, was tapping a stylus against her chin in a repetitive, entirely non-functional motion. Another, Chen Jian, was staring intently at a blank data slate, occasionally muttering to himself. The third, Adebir Samuel, was currently attempting to explain something to a Cathar junior technician, using wide, sweeping arm movements that seemed to suggest the flight path of an erratic insect. Their methodologies are unconventional, Vrel transmitted in the precise, uninflected tones of Cathar high logic. Overseer Thaln, a Cathar of considerable standing, whose cranial ridges were deeper and more pronounced, indicating his advanced age and processing power, inclined his head a mere millimeter. The Council designated this experiment Prime Analyst. Their species, despite its manifest disorganization, has shown sporadic, inexplicable leaps in understanding. We are here to observe if such creativity can be quantified or at least directed. Vrel did not voice his skepticism. It would be illogical. The data, however sparse, suggested humans sometimes stumbled upon solutions that eluded more structured intellects. The prevailing Cathar theory was that it was akin to random data corruption occasionally producing a functional, if unexpected, output. Undesirable, but perhaps, in this one instance, useful. They have been given access to all unclassified data regarding the anomaly, Vrel reported. Their request for more squishy chairs and better coffee has been logged and regrettably fulfilled. Thaln's optical filaments twitched, the Cathar equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Indeed, let us observe their initial diagnostic approaches. In the human chamber, Alara Jones finally stopped tapping. "Okay, hear me out," she said, her voice carrying easily through the audio pickups. "What if it's not trying to be anything? What if it's like the universe's pop rock? You know, those things that just appear in your kettle?" Chen, without looking up from his blank slate, grunted. "Limescale, calcium carbonate deposits, not exactly defying the laws of physics, Alara." "No, no, not literally limescale," Alara said, waving her hand dismissively. "I mean the principle of it, something that forms from background noise, latent potential. What if this anomaly isn't a thing but a consequence of things, a ripple?" Samuel Adebir, having finally managed to convey something about lateral thinking to the bewildered Cathar technician using a series of diagrams that looked like a child's scribble, turned back to his team. A ripple implies a source, an originating event. The Cathar have scanned for exotic particle collisions, temporal distortions, everything. Nada. But what if the event isn't an event in the way they think of an event? Alara persisted, her eyes bright. Their logic is all a plus B equals C. What if this is more jazz, improv? Vrel, listening in, felt a familiar throb of irritation in his processing core. Jazz. Improv. These were terms for uncontrolled, random generation of auditory stimuli. How could such concepts apply to fundamental physics? They are referencing primitive artistic expressions, Vrel informed Thaln. It appears to be a metaphor. A deeply flawed one, Thaln agreed. Continue observation. For several Terran days, the humans did not, in Cathar terms, do much. They talked, they argued, they drew bizarre diagrams on their data slates. Chen filled his with what looked like abstract floral patterns. Alara covered hers in interconnected bubbles filled with questions. Samuel built elaborate, shifting structures in a holographic sandbox, none of which seemed to relate to the anomaly's known properties. They requested access to seemingly irrelevant Cathar databases. Mythology, linguistic drift patterns of extinct species, architectural failures. The Cathar observers watched with growing impatience, their reports to the council becoming increasingly filled with phrases like lack of structured inquiry and reliance on emotional heuristics. Then one day, Chen looked up from a particularly dense Cathar treatise on failed warp field geometries, a text most Cathar considered a monument to incorrect assumptions. The Cathar approach to warp travel, it's all about symmetrical expansion and contraction of spacetime, right? Perfect balance. What if this anomaly isn't balanced at all? What if it's inherently, fundamentally, lopsided? Ilara snapped her fingers. Yes, like a badly thrown part on a wheel. It wobbles, it wants to fly apart, but something is holding its lopsidedness in a weird kind of tension. Samuel pulled up a simulation of the anomaly, its chaotic energy patterns swirling within the containment field display. The Cathar have tried to stabilize it by applying symmetrical damping fields. It's like trying to catch a falling cat by grabbing it perfectly in the middle. It just squirms more. So what if, Alara said, leaning forward, her voice dropping conspiratorially, we don't try to fix its lopsidedness? What if we lean into it? What if we push it further off balance, but in a controlled way so it sort of overcorrects itself into a new, stable, lopsided state? Vrel, in the observation deck, almost made an audible sound of protest. This was insanity. To intentionally destabilize an already unstable phenomenon. It was akin to treating a fire by adding more fuel, but in a specific, artistic pattern. They are proposing to introduce further instability, Vrel stated, his voice flat with disapproval. Thaln's cranial ridges seemed to tighten. This is illogical in the extreme. Document their proposal. We will, of course, run simulations before allowing any direct interaction. The humans, oblivious to the Cathar's consternation, began to sketch out their idea. It wasn't a mathematical formula. It wasn't a series of logical steps. It was more like a choreography. They spoke of resonant frequencies, not in terms of pure wave mechanics, but in terms of finding its rhythm. They talked about nudging the anomaly with targeted energy pulses, not to counter its behavior, but to encourage its weirdness in a particular direction. The Cathar technicians assigned to translate these notions into viable simulation parameters were on the verge of systemic breakdown. They ask us to model spicy energy, one reported, its voice tremoring with distress. Spicy, Prime Analyst. What is the quantitative value of spicy? Ilara had tried to explain. It's like, when a flavor has a kick. A little bit of controlled pain that's also pleasurable. We need an energy signature that's jarring but not destructive. Something that makes the anomaly go, ooh, what's that? And lean into it. Samuel had chimed in. Think of it as a counterintuitive dance move. You lead it one way, then abruptly shift, making it follow the momentum. Chen, meanwhile, had been studying ancient human martial arts philosophies. Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless like water. If you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. This anomaly, we need to become the anomaly, understand its flow, not fight it. The initial Cathar simulations based on these inputs were predictably catastrophic. Virtual anomalies either imploded, exploded, or simply unraveled into chaotic static. Their approach is demonstrably false, Vrel reported to Thaln, a sliver of grim satisfaction in his tone. The random introduction of unquantifiable variables yields only increased entropy. But the humans weren't deterred. They studied the failed simulations with an odd sort of cheerful detachment. Okay, so not that spicy, Alara would say. More a piquant nudge. The flow was wrong, Chen mused. We tried to force it. We need to invite it. It was Samuel who had the next idea, staring at a Cathar artistic representation of a black hole, a perfectly symmetrical, aesthetically pleasing, but scientifically simplified image. They see perfection in symmetry, he murmured. What if the universe doesn't? What if true stability, especially for something this weird, comes from accepted imperfection? Like a well-worn, comfortable old shoe. It's not perfect, but it fits. He turned to the Cathar lead simulationist, a being named Unit 734. Can you model imperfection? Not random noise, but a persistent, slight asymmetry in the containment field itself. Like giving it a permanent lean, a bias. Unit 734, whose logical processors were already strained, could only manage a series of bewildered clicks, which roughly translated to, "This is counter to all design principles of containment." But Thaln surprisingly overrode the objection. The previous parameters have failed. The human approach, however unorthodox, is the variable we are here to test. Implement a persistent, minor asymmetric bias in the simulation's containment parameters, and then apply their dance steps. The Cathar team, with deep misgivings, did so. They introduced a tiny, constant imbalance to the simulated containment field. Then, following the humans' increasingly refined, but still maddeningly vague instructions, a little cha-cha here, a sudden waltz dip there, they began to input the sequenced energy pulses. For the first few microseconds of the simulation, the anomaly writhed even more violently. Vrel prepared his next report on the inherent flaws of human thought. And then it happened. The anomaly, instead of collapsing or exploding, seemed to settle. It didn't become symmetrical. It didn't become predictable in the Cathar sense. Instead, it adopted a new, stable, asymmetrical configuration. It pulsed with a steady, albeit off-kilter, rhythm. The paradoxical energy readings didn't vanish. They harmonized, forming a complex but coherent pattern. It was like a discordant orchestra suddenly finding a shared, alien melody. Silence fell in the Cathar observation deck. It was a profound silence, deeper than the usual regulated quiet. Vrel stared at the data readouts, his multifaceted eyes cycling through focus modes as if unable to believe the input. The numbers were impossible, and yet they were undeniably there. Thaln slowly turned his head towards the human observation chamber. The humans were celebrating. Alara was high-fiving Samuel. Chen actually had a small, pleased smile on his face. They looked for all the world like people who had just solved a particularly enjoyable puzzle. It stabilized, Vrel finally managed, his voice a mere whisper, stripped of all its usual certitude. The asymmetrical bias, the sequenced, non-linear pulses, it responded to artistic metaphor. Thaln did not speak for a long moment. His cranial ridges seemed to be working, as if his brain itself were physically reconfiguring. They did not solve the anomaly's physics in our terms, he said at last, his voice resonating with a new, unfamiliar tone. They befriended it. They coaxed it. They treated a fundamental force of the universe not as an equation to be solved, but as a difficult personality to be understood. He looked back at the stable, pulsing, gloriously lopsided anomaly. Their chaos, their emotionalism, their inefficiency, it is not a flaw in their processing. It is a different kind of processing, one that can perceive patterns, solutions that our rigid logic, by its very definition, cannot. The implications were staggering. For millennia, the Cathar had prided themselves on their pure, unwavering logic. It was the foundation of their technology, their society, their identity. To discover that another species, a younger, messier, seemingly primitive species, possessed a cognitive tool that could unlock doors the Cathar hadn't even known existed, it was more than humbling. It was terrifying, and in a strange, unsettling way, exhilarating. The energy signature, Vrel said, still reeling. It's not just stable, It's potent, vastly more potent than we ever theorized. This new configuration, it could revolutionize power generation, FTL travel, everything. Thal nodded slowly. They did not just stabilize it, they have perhaps shown us the next step in cosmic understanding. He gestured towards the humans. For cycles, we have dismissed them, seen them as background noise. But it seems the noise itself can contain the symphony if one has the ears to hear it. The report sent to the Cathar Council was unlike any previously submitted. It spoke of intuitive leaps, metaphorical reasoning, and the efficacy of structured chaos. It caused an unprecedented uproar. Many traditionalists called for the immediate cessation of the human experiment, fearing contamination of Cathar thought. But the data from the stabilized anomaly was undeniable. A new form of energy, a new branch of physics, had been unveiled not by cold calculation, but by, well, whatever it was the humans had done. The Cathar Federation, a civilization that had not fundamentally altered its core philosophies for eons, began to change. Cautiously, reluctantly at first, they established new research divisions. They weren't called institutes of logic. They were nicknamed, in hushed whispers at first, then more openly, chaos labs. Cathar scientists were paired with human ideators, tasked not with finding logical solutions, but with exploring the illogical, the absurd, the what-if scenarios that Cathar brains were conditioned to reject. It was a painful, difficult process for many Cathar. To embrace ambiguity, to value a hunch over a proven theorem, went against every fiber of their being. But the results, slowly, began to trickle in. New materials with impossible properties, new understandings of cosmological phenomena, solutions to centuries-old engineering problems, found not by refining existing algorithms, but by asking, what if we tried the stupidest thing possible just to see what happens? Humanity's standing in the Cathar Federation, and by extension, the wider galaxy that looked to the Cathar as paragons of intellect, shifted dramatically. They were no longer the chaotic, emotional primitives. They were the keepers of a strange, wild, and undeniably powerful form of genius. They were the ones who could dance with the universe's anomalies and coax out their secrets. Vrel, now overseeing one of the first chaos labs, often found himself observing the human participants. They still frustrated him with their roundabout conversations, their emotional outbursts, their love of squishy chairs and good coffee. But now, when Alara Jones started talking about physics in terms of jazz, or Chen sketched patterns that looked more like art than science, Vrel listened. He didn't always understand. In fact, he rarely understood. But he was learning that understanding wasn't always the point. Sometimes, the point was to simply open your mind to the music of the illogical and see where the rhythm took you. The Cathar had spent eons mastering the score. The humans, it turned out, were masters of improvisation. And the universe, it seemed, loved a good jam session.